Tonight, going to talk a bit about the Spain and Portugal blackout on the 28th of April this year. Firstly, a bit of a background to the power system of Spain, what they've got and where it is, what happened on the 28th, why did it happen, possible causes, and remedy. Now, we'll have a time for questions at the end. So if one particular slide grabs your interest and you want to ask a question about it, just remember the number in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can use that. We'll go back to it if we need to. Okay, so Spain, just some geography. 506 square kilometres compared to Australia's 7,000. So obviously we're quite a bit bigger. They've got more people, 49 million compared to ours. But the unusual thing is that Spain actually is quite away from the equator. It's actually, if you turn it upside down and put it down here, the top of Spain is actually the same as the bottom of Tasmania. And the hottest part of Spain is only as far as Albury. So you can see the latitudes here to get the rough numbers. So it's quite unusual. Spain's climate is always regarded as quite a hot climate. And obviously that must be because of the South Africa with the Sahara Desert and so on. Now, Spain is a world leader in concentrated solar thermal power. It was the first to use large-scale photovoltaic PV. 50% of their energy came from renewables in 2023, and they're targeting 74% by 2032. Their only coal-fired unit, or the main station they've got left, is in cold storage. And there you can see the solar radiation, obviously much higher in the south of Spain and diminishing as you go to the north. And the wind over here these are the wind installations by province. And you can see there's a lot of wind up the north end compared to the south, the opposite of the solar. They first started with solar towers, and there's a couple here. These are the first couple, 11 megawatts and 20 megawatts, both using superheated steam created in the top of these towers. And then eventually they went to this molten salt version, which allowed 24 operation, Gemma Solar. But they've only got about 51 megawatts. That's all they've ever installed. And I think the reason was they're just very expensive and a lot of maintenance and so on. They then went to concentrating parabolic troughs. And there's a bit of a diagram there showing the reflector, the curved bit, and the middle bit is the receiver. And it's filled with whatever. It might be water to steam, or it might be molten salt. And this reflector rotates around to follow the sun. They had 2,250, but the last one was built in 2013. And after that, I think what's happened that the solar PV just got so much cheaper. Their biggest one is 150 megawatts. It's got molten salt and it can go for 7.5 hours overnight. And you can see here 3 by 50 megawatt units. There's actually three squares there. About 12% capacity factor, but using molten salt. Solar photovoltaic, they've got about 20,000 megawatts in solar PV farms, and about 8,000 odd in rooftop PV systems. Most of the rooftop systems, though, seem to be more in the industrial and commercial areas, with residential rooftop PV being the smaller portion, which is in the opposite of what we've got. Their biggest solar park is 850 megawatts. That's huge. And it's the largest one in Spain, 17 separate parallel sites, and covering about 3,000 hectares. That's the biggest one. These are some solar tracking PV panels. The previous slide, they're fixed panels, but this one, they tracking PVs. They rotate and track the sun. And here's an example of the commercial industrial where they sort of build parking stations and just plaster them with rooftop PV. They They had a big go on back here in about 2007 with a big chunk of solar PV, and this was the big growth here in the concentrating solar thermal. But once it got to about 2013, they stopped the solar uh, thermal parabolic, and even the PV stopped for a while. I think they were just coming to grips with how much it was all costing. But then in about 2018, off they went again, and the PVs obviously just dominating there. Um, and you can see down here some of the numbers. A lot of these numbers are just all that I managed to find. Obviously, they don't publish things straight away, and it's hard to find a lot of things. So some of these are the blue ones, just my estimates here, but about 20,000 of solar PV there, according to the graphs. Wind farms, they've got about 30,000 megawatts. That's huge. 22,000 wind turbines and producing about 61,000 gigawatt hours a year. But wind turbines trip out of service when the local system voltage or the system frequency exceeds preset limits. And of course, a wind turbine can only run when the wind speed is enough to spin the turbine and not too much to blow it away. And you can see in here the wind got a fair go on early on, this sort of lull period like the thermal PVs and whatever, and then off it went again. So this is the best I could find about where all the PVs and whatever are. Solar PV, this was 2022, 19,000. So it's obviously higher than that now, 1 or 2,000. Solar thermal, mainly parabolic trough, as we discussed earlier, 2250, of which 500 has some storage. But all the solar thermal stopped in 2013. They didn't build any more after that due to cost. Wind power, about 30,000. Hydro, they've got quite a reasonable amount of hydro, nearly 4,000 megawatts of hydro. These seem to be mainly run of river, not a huge amount of storage for controlling the generation. They do have a lot of pump storage though, 6,000 megawatts, which is quite a lot. And this Cortes La Mula is the biggest. It's actually a double station. Nuclear, about 8,000, a mixture of pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors. And fossil fuel, this cold storage coal and natural gas, CCGT, that's combined cycle gas turbine. So that's like an open cycle gas turbine, and the exhaust heat then goes through a boiler to capture the remaining energy, and they can get efficiencies of up to 60%. And there's about 6,600 of those. Down the bottom, batteries, 60 megawatts. Well, we blow that out of the water. We've got nearly about 2,000 megawatts here. So there's Spain. This is showing the grid. The red lines are 400 kV, and you can see a bit of a concentration here. That's where Madrid is. Down the bottom here, that's the across the Straits of Gibraltar to Morocco, interconnection. Up here, interconnection to France. There's 1,400 megawatts of AC capacity and 1,400 megawatts of high voltage direct current capacity installed in 2015, totaling 2,800. Morocco is about 600 to 900, depending on the conditions. That's this bit. Portugal, there's no real limit per se. There's a lot of lines across to Portugal, and it's not regarded in the same sense of a limiting cross section like France or Morocco is. And there is some minor supplies out to some of the islands. That's their control room. Red Electrica de España is the operator, and that's just showing. There's their load curve over here. That's the actual, the yellow, and the green and the red are forecast and some market. I don't know why they have two, but they have two forecasts. Not recently, they announced that on April the 16th, their renewables supplied 100.6% of their load in Spain, 106%. And a few days later, the solar PV reached about 20 gigawatts. Unfortunately, only a matter of 2 weeks later, it was dig out the candles, and there was a blackout on the 28th of April. It affected Spain, Portugal, Andorra, and of course it affected Morocco, but Morocco didn't black out. It was said to be the worst blackout in Europe in living memory. 58 million people affected by the loss of power, which lasted up to 12 hours in some areas. Considering what happened, I think they were pretty good in getting the power back. The regional operator published this table here of the prior generation conditions, and I've translated it over here into a table. So generating just before the blackouts, wind 3,600, solar 18,000, solar thermal, that's the parabolic and the solar towers, and hydro 3.7, nuclear 3.3, coal and diesel 491, combined cycle 1,600. It's obviously backed off quite a lot, and cogeneration and waste steam and that sort of stuff. So they had a total generation of 33,000 odd megawatts, of which the load itself of Spain was 26,000, and the exports and whatever, pumping was 3,000. Export to France was 868, export to Portugal 2652, and to Morocco 782. So 22% of their generation up here, was being used by exports and pumping, and 78% of their generation was used for supplying their load. Renewables, which is the green ones up here, totaled, that's these ones here, 26,000, which was 101.2% of their load. A little unusual, but not knowing the full details, the hydro, to be pumping water and running hydro is unusual, but these are probably run a river, and this is for storage for overnight. So quite a lot of renewables there running. Well, what happened? At 12:33, things were going fine until until the event. Red Electrica operator said about 18,000 coming from solar, 3,500 from wind, 3,000 from nuclear. That's about the same. They're the rounded numbers of that table. Roughly 2/3 of the supply came from wind and solar, and 1/3 coming from traditional spinning machines. We would regard hydro as renewable as well, but they've separated it out. Anyway, there was a sudden loss of generation in the southwest, and it's the home to all those massive solar farms. One farm tripped and the system absorbed it, but then 1.5 seconds later, a second drop occurred when another wind solar farm tripped. Demand surged onto the interconnected with France, tripped from overload. Spain and Portugal were cut off from the rest of Europe. The peninsula became an island without enough internal synchronous generation. Frequency collapse. Automatic under-frequency protection systems operated, trying to oscillate the fault, but was too big and it went black. The nuclears, they go into a shutdown mode designed to protect the reactors. So this is a little bit more detail about the actual sequence of events. Interesting, at 12:03, which is half hour before, there were some oscillations in the grid detected and mitigated. This is, by the way, from their logs, timeline of events. And then at 20 past, there was another second period of oscillations detected and mitigated. 12:33, a series of generation trips in southern Spain. These are the solar PV farms, first near Granada, then Badajoz and thirdly near Seville, causing the loss of 2,200 megawatts of generation. The frequency decreased and the voltage increased. Now, if you look over here on this little graph here, this is the frequency of Europe, but measured in Germany. And of course, Spain is connected to Europe before the event, so it's experiencing the same sort of frequency fluctuations. Now, they've put on their little graph, they've put grid separation there. Well, it's not. That's the start of the events. That's the first tripping there. And what happened? The frequency started to fall. And at this point here, 49.85 hertz, that's not a huge deviation, but the interconnector with France opened. And of course, Europe, measured at Germany, recovered. Its frequency went back up and back up around 50 hertz again. Whereas Spain went down the gurgle at 48 hertz and then collapsed. 48 hertz seems to be the frequency of the automatic under frequency load shedding is activated. We have that here. It's sort of a last ditch resort. If you have a major interruption, loss of generation beyond normal contingencies, you start to shed customers, usually at 33 kV feeders, and try and arrest the decline in frequency. They couldn't. The grid collapsed completely, and they say here that's when the high voltage DC link to France tripped. I'm not sure about that, but that's what they're saying. It's only 24 seconds later anyway. The bottom bit is the restoration, and it's pretty good, really. The first thing they did was close back onto France and then onto Morocco, and then they started to get their hydros going, the black start ones, and for a sequence of events, they gradually got the power back together. I won't go into all of that at this point. Well, why did the Spanish solar farms trip? That's the key. Why did they trip in the first place? And as you saw earlier, Red Electrica recorded some oscillations at 1207 and 1219. However, there were voltage oscillations in the Madrid area that started mid-morning and worsened around the middle of the day when, of course, the solar output was at maximum, and so were exports to Portugal, France and Morocco. The Spain market price at the time was minus €1. Now, very interesting, this guy, Bob Marshall from Whisker Labs, he had some sensors, voltage sensors in various locations in and around Madrid, testing his technology for home fire prevention and grid monitoring and whatever. Around 9:30, he saw some oscillations. But he's noted the oscillations increased over the next 3 hours until these major oscillations occurred. And in fact, around midday, the oscillations were 15 volts up and down every 1.5 seconds. So that's 15 volts it's a 230 volt domestic supply there. So plus minus, the oscillation was thus plus or minus 6.5%. But it was probably higher at the wind farms, and I'll explain why in a little further. The frequency of these voltage oscillations was the order of 1 hertz. So it's much slower than, of course, the 50 hertz stuff. It's a different oscillation. So why did the grid farms trip? And where did these oscillations come from? Well, the solar PV farms, of course, the protection systems and control systems are generally set by the inverter makers who meet whatever the standards are required at the time of installation. And if you know our market here, AEMO, keeps changing the rules and making things more stringent and harder and so on. So I'm sure that happened over there too. Importantly, the solar farms have inverters to convert the DC supply to AC, but they're grid following, not grid forming, grid following. and thus they do not support the grid, but rather they protect the solar farm from externally caused damage from the grid. Now, an example is of interest here. This is Texas, near Odessa in 2022. There was actually an electrical fault, a high voltage fault occurred. A surge arrestor actually blew up and caused a B-phase to ground fault. The fault cleared in 3 cycles, which is high-speed protection, but that disconnected about 333 megawatts directly because of what tripped as a consequence. But other units also tripped, but the worst was 1,711 megawatts of inverter-based resources also tripped. I managed to find the actual protection systems that operated at the time. Now there's things like inverter, instantaneous AC overcurrent for 459 megawatts, instantaneous AC overvoltage 295, under DC bus voltage unbalance, and so on. There's a whole lot of different things there, but importantly, there's some undervoltage and overvoltage and undervoltage and overcurrent. Now, if I put my system operator hat on, this is very similar to what I've seen before. It's a steady state voltage instability. This can happen when you have too much power flowing across the grid with too low synchronizing power flow and inadequate damping of the steady state voltage or power oscillations. The grid following inverters, in fact, may have served to amplify the voltage oscillations. The grid following circuitry has a thing called a phase locked loop, and it basically just mimics the supply voltage. So if the supply voltage is not sine wave, but it's got little ripples on it, it will do the same thing. It'll follow those ripples. And if you've got 20,000 megawatts coming out supporting those ripples, well, guess what? It supports and amplifies those voltage oscillations. Now, these voltage oscillations, I believe, at about 1 hertz, eventually tripped the first solar farm on, it could have been under or over voltage protection of the AC. The AC voltage was either too high or too low. And then, of course, the second PV farm followed. The system frequency fell, the interconnectors, the flow reversed on the interconnectors, they overloaded and tripped. The system island and fell to bits. The nuclear power went into safe mode. Under frequency operator was ineffective. The solution, how do you fix that? You can't run back and install 20,000 megawatts of coal-fired spinning alternators. Well, the first thing you do would be install large batteries with what's called virtual inertia and also power system stabilizing capability, such as grid forming converters. Now, the virtual inertia, what that means is that when the frequency does fall, the battery can supply extra power to slow that rate of change. The inertia actually affects the rate of change of the frequency fall. It doesn't solve the problem, it just simply slows that rate. But they can also whack out extra power. So, and they can also have power system stabilizing capability. And they've now got an ambitious program to go from 60 megawatts to 22,000 megawatts of batteries by 2030. So I think that's I think we've been a bit ahead of all that. We've been putting batteries in well before we got to this high level of renewable supply. That's one thing you can do. Another thing is to expand the strength of the grid itself and the interconnectors. And there is a interconnection project. It's called the 400 kV Bay of Biscay interconnection, and that'll increase the interconnection with France from the current 2,800 to 5,000 in 2028. And you can see this little diagram here. This is the Pyrenees here, a little place called Bilbao. There's a substation Gatica, and you can see the high voltage DC link up here to France near Bordeaux. And of course, I looked at that and said, why didn't they go straight across? And I didn't realise, but there's this huge Cape Breton Canyon. And it starts 300 metres offshore and it goes down to 4,000 metres deep. So it's a bit tricky to put a cable across the top of that. So they've actually run it undersea, come ashore, run underground for a bit, then go back out in the ocean and up and so on. So that's quite unusual, that. The other thing you can do is add more physical inertia, and synchronous condensers is the answer there. They provide extra inertia. They can also control voltage, and they can help increase what's called system strength. And I just noticed tonight that there's a whole bunch of more synchronous condensers to be installed in our system. They're just back on these power system stabilizers. Well, back in 1985, we had a steady state voltage oscillation between New South Wales and Victoria, and it was the same sort of magnitude of the voltage variation. In our case, the system operator resolved the issue with no impact on supply, but subsequently we installed power system stabilizers on all our large coal-fired units, such as Bayswater, Raring, Mount Piper, and down in Victoria at Loy Yang and so on. Now, there's also a blackout in South Australia back in 2016, and many press reports and commentators likened the Spain shutdown to the 2016 shutdown. However, while South Australia by itself has a lot of renewable generation, we're running out of time. We've got 9 minutes. It's all right. The South Australian event was largely different. It was caused by 3 275 kV transmission lines were blown down by extreme downforce winds. It's a bit like a tornado. So it blew down 3 transmission lines. There were 6 severe voltage dips as the lines hit the ground and things reclosed and then tripped back out again. And it actually tripped 456 megawatts of wind farms in their case over a 7-second period due to a limit on the number of voltage dips that you can have over a 2-second period. I'd never heard of that one before, but that's what the wind farms have got as well as normal things. The interconnectors then tripped on overload, South Australia islanded and blacked out. So as I say, similarities, a lot of renewable energy there compared to Spain, but this was a major fault on high voltage faults, a series of high voltage faults, where Spain was nothing. There was no actual fault on the system. It was just sitting there and started to get a wobble. In South Australia's case, they expedited the installation of the Hornsdale 150 megawatt battery. Well, it was 100 initially, now it's 150. And it also provides synthetic inertia, fast frequency response. And so it's quite good for when you do lose a generator. And of course, that's even quicker than some of the conventional generators. Batteries in the NEM, there's about 3,000 megawatts of battery storage in the NEM at present, but there's about 10,000 on the books in the planning books, and this excludes the rooftop PV. The highest output of those batteries so far was 1531 megawatts only a matter of weeks ago. Just recapping on Spain, currently only 60 megawatts, and they're targeting 22,000 megawatts by 2030. But I still wonder how they get on overnight with so little energy storage and such massive solar PV and wind and so on. It's got a bit of pump storage and so on, but they must rely very heavily on France and Morocco and Portugal. But the home of the big batteries is actually California. Hornsdale, the 100 megawatts at South Australia's Hornsdale was the biggest when it was installed. But California now has 10,000 megawatts of batteries. That's the highest.